The Vietnam War was a fight between ideologies: capitalism versus communism, communist nationalism versus regular nationalism. But it was also a stage for competing military doctrines. The communist world focuses on the ground and people. Communist doctrine uses the weight of infantry and armor, coordinated with massed, focused artillery, to overwhelm its enemy. During the Vietnam War, the Soviet Union and Communist China delivered massive amounts of infantry equipment, and later on, armor. The Soviets later outfitted the North Vietnamese with state-of-the-art 122mm and 130mm howitzers. The weight of this artillery, alongside the armored fist of the People's Army of Vietnam, eventually took down the Republic of Vietnam. The free world, on the other hand, takes to the skies. The United States Air Force and Navy specialized in delivering precision strikes in support of surface operations. Air dominance has become the backbone of Western military doctrine. Throughout the Cold War and into the present day, American birds remain uncontested, enjoying the latest in cutting-edge technology, and are flown by some of the best trained pilots in the world. There is no equal in the air. Following the advice and guidance of our American allies, the Republic of Vietnam developed a substantial air force of its own, the Republic of Vietnam Air Force, also called the Vietnam Air Force. Constantly flying against communist ground forces, South Vietnam eventually cultivated a corps of excellent ground strike pilots who were very well regarded by American advisors on the ground. Unfortunately for those pilots, they have faded into history. Their small unit precision strikes were overshadowed by the massive American bombing operations in North Vietnam, which captivated media and public attention. Even then, the Vietnam Air Force and its personnel performed their duty in the shadows for more than 20 years of war, since its humble beginnings as a neglected group of pilots beside the French. The South Vietnamese Air Force, like many of the other military services of South Vietnam, had its origins with the French. In 1951, after constantly being requested by the last Nguyen Dynasty Emperor, Bảo Đại, the French finally agreed to form a Vietnamese Air Force. Unfortunately, like many other Vietnamese units during this time, the French neglected them. The first Vietnamese pilots could only serve as backups for French pilots. Only small numbers of pilots, observers, and maintenance personnel started to be trained in Nha Trang starting March 1952. By the time of the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, 1954, the VNAF consisted of only 1,345 people, under the lone Vietnamese 1st Liaison Group. It was equipped with 58 aircraft, composed of 2 Marine 500 Cricket Observer Squadrons and a single MD-315 Transport Squadron. However, with the signing of the Geneva Conventions and the French pulling out, it was clear that South Vietnam would need to aggressively expand its armed forces to face the communist threat. Now, under American guidance, the Vietnam Air Force was transferred 1 F-8F fighter bomber squadron, 2 C-47 transport squadrons, 2 L-19 recon squadrons, and some H-19 helicopters in August 1955. Within the next 3 years, the 1st Air Transport Group, the 1st Fighter Squadron, and a Special Air Mission Squadron would be formed. Even then, the Vietnamese Air Force continued to fall behind the Army. The F-8Fs were completely worn out in response to accelerating communist strikes. In 1960, they were forcefully grounded by Air Force Commander Colonels Nguyen Xuan Vinh due to being completely unsafe to fly. U.S. assistance delivered 86s as a replacement. The 86s would eventually become the backbone of the VNAF strike force with its alternate name, the A-1 Sky Raider. This would be the trend for VNAF support over the next decade. While its personnel were being trained, its already outdated aircraft had to almost break down before replacements were given. In late 1960, the H-19 helicopters were also completely worn out. MAG was forced to rush in H-34s to replace them. It was still clear at this stage of the war that the ARVN would continue to be the focus of United States assistance. The Vietnam Air Force would be given whatever equipment could be spared. By 1961, the VNAF only had one A-1 Skyraider, two C-47 Skytrain, two L-19 Bird Dog, and one H-19 Chickasaw Squadron in service. Unlike the American system between the U.S. Air Force and Army, where the two services operated as equals, the South Vietnamese system developed with the Army as the priority. Due to the sensitive political situation in the countryside, President Ngo Dinh Diem prioritized ground operations, then airborne operations, and finally airstrikes to achieve military objectives, yet also minimize civilian casualties. Because of this, during the early war, the Vietnam Air Force was trained, equipped, and deployed to support the Army. It would focus on airlift, paradrops, visual and photo reconnaissance, and medical evacuation. The VNAF could not approve its own ground attacks to avoid hitting civilians. Approval for strikes was required from the province chief, regional commander, the Joint General Staff, or even the President himself. The Air Force was forced to rely on Army approval. Unfortunately, both the ARVN and VNAF had a lot of trouble coordinating with each other. Many soldiers on the ground had recently enlisted and were still training for ground operations, much less multi-service operations. This, combined with the high-level approvals, meant that strikes were rarely requested, and if they were, usually arrived too late, after Communist forces had slipped away. By late 1961, the need for better air support became critical. The United States decided to deploy the 4400th Combat Crew Training Squadron to South Vietnam as part of Operation Farmgate. Farmgate's mission was to train Vietnamese pilots with their T-28s and B-26s, while also flying supplemental strike missions desperately needed on the ground. The men of Farmgate would become the spearhead for anti-insurgency air operations for all American airmen who would enter the country later on. But with Farmgate's deployment, it was clear that crucial infrastructure was not available. Larger air bases started to be constructed throughout South Vietnam. Da Nang for Region 1, Pleiku and Nha Trang for Region 2, Tan Son Nhut and Bien Hoa for Region 3, Cần Thơ and Sóc Trăng for Region 4. They were equipped with larger runways, hangars, service shops, and other technical equipment needed for any modern air force. In early 1962, the U.S. Air Force started to set up a tactical air control system. The Tactical Air Control Center, located at Tan Son Nhut Airport, was the central command point to control and coordinate aircraft using the TACS. Supporting facilities were built in Nha Trang and Pleiku to provide coverage over the entire country. The TACC coordinated the flight of aircraft from takeoff to its mission and back to base. To grant ground forces better access to air cover, General LeMay obtained permission to assign air liaison officers to all ARVN Corps and Division headquarters to streamline coordination with the RVNAF. Requests were being sent more efficiently to the JGS in Saigon, where the TAC would execute the mission. Immediately, ARVN helicopter assaults escorted by fighters jumped from 10% to 40%, resulting in far fewer helicopter losses. After some bad ambushes, air cover for all train and road convoys were mandated, effectively bringing the number of ambushes to zero. To provide the best direct control for airstrikes in the battlefield, forward air controllers were deployed in the local airspace. These were small, observer aircraft which could see the tactical situation directly and coordinate with ground forces. With the live information, FACs could redirect strikes to better target communist formations or avoid civilians. The best FACs could regulate the number of aircraft in the sky, keeping a constant stream of aircraft hitting targets, as needed by forces on the ground. This was the fundamental operational setup of the Vietnam Air Force. Ground forces requested airstrikes through ALOs, which were then fulfilled by the TACC, deploying aircraft to the field. An FAC would take over control over the battlefield to guide in the strike, before releasing them back to base. Even with this newfound efficiency, the VNAF continued to be sidelined as the U.S. Air Force was deployed. ARVN and U.S. forces on the ground preferred to request American FACs and strike aircraft since they could call in the faster and more powerful F-4s, F-105s, and F-100s, while the Vietnamese Air Force was restricted to A-1s and T-28s. These American jets, due to their high speed, arrived faster. The speed also helped them fly close air support, regardless of anti-air in the area, while the A-1s and T-28s had to be held back from more intense AA fire. Even then, the VNAF was slowly equipped with more aircraft. More squadrons and tactical wings were activated as equipment was delivered and men were trained. By 1966, the ARVNAF had grown to 13,000 men and was equipped with 359 aircraft. There were now 5 tactical wings: the 23rd Tactical Wing at Bien Hoa, the 33rd Tactical Wing at Tan Son Nhut, the 41st Tactical Wing at Da Nang, the 62nd at Nha Trang, and the 74th at Binh Thuy. All fighter units were eventually standardized to be equipped with A-1Hs, finally replacing the worn-out B-26s and T-28s. An additional 2 fighter squadrons were scheduled to be raised that year for a total of 6, equipped with 146 A-1 Sky Raiders. There were also 4 H-34 helicopter squadrons, 4 O-1 liaison squadrons, and 2 of 3 planned C-47 transport squadrons now available. At this point, the VNAF's advisors shifted objectives. Instead of trying to expand the VNAF, they would work towards modernizing it instead. The H-34s would gradually be replaced by UH-1s, and the C-47s, which were World War II era aircraft, would be replaced by C-119s. Remaining C-47s were converted to AC-47 Spooky gunships. The ARVNAF finally received its first jets. In 1967, 2 of 6 fighter squadrons were converted to F-5s, and 3 others were earmarked for A-37 Dragonflies, which were still being tested. Former Air Force Commander Premier Nguyen Cao Ky personally handpicked the 33 pilots of the 1st F-5 Squadron of South Vietnam. While the VNAF was still using outdated equipment, it was rapidly developing into an efficient fighting force. It was a fully volunteer force and did not suffer from a manpower shortage or desertion rates like other branches of the Republic of Vietnam Armed Forces. The VNAF was considered to be well motivated by its advisors and executed a quarter of strike sorties. Ground crew demonstrated that they could maintain all 6 aircraft available to them. The Vietnamese airmen performed beyond expectations during the 1968 Tet Offensive. 55% of personnel were on leave for the holidays, but 90% were back in service within 72 hours. Missions were accomplished far faster, while only less than 1% of personnel were lost in battle. The U.S. Air Force advisors could clearly see that the VNAF was on its way to becoming a modern, effective jet-age fighting force. However, ready or not, the Republic of Vietnam Air Force would soon be forced to take over the war. American forces had started redeploying out of Vietnam. From 1970 until the 1972 Easter Offensive, the VNAF would aggressively expand from 22 squadrons with 486 aircraft to 44 squadrons with 1,285 aircraft. There were now 9 fighter squadrons equipped with A-1s, F-5s, and A-37s, 2 gunship squadrons with AC-47s and AC-119s, 7 FAC squadrons with O-1s and U-17s, and 17 helicopter squadrons with Hueys and other heavy-lift helicopters. The remaining 14 squadrons flew training, transport, and reconnaissance missions. The number of personnel jumped from 17,000 to 50,000. To handle this expansion, the Air Force had to undergo a major reorganization. The 1st Air Division was activated at Da Nang Air Base to support Region 1. The 2nd Air Division would form at Nha Trang for Region 2, the 3rd at Bien Hoa for Region 3, and the 4th at Binh Thuy for Region 4. A 5th Division was formed at Tan Son Nhut Air Base, which specialized in gunship and special transport missions. The single Tactical Air Command Center based at Tan Son Nhut was decentralized. It was replaced with direct air support centers located at Da Nang, Pleiku, Bien Hoa, and Binh Thuy. each serving a military region and granting more direct control to the corps commanders. It became more difficult for aircraft to be controlled between regions, but their shorter ranges meant that they could barely fly between regions anyways. By this point in the war, South Vietnamese ground strike pilots had years of experience and were very well regarded by ARVN troops and American advisors. They had performed quite well during the Cambodian campaign, flying nearly half of attack sorties. During the Easter Offensive, FACs took advantage of the constant stream of American and South Vietnamese strike aircraft to keep back the Communist Combined Arms Strike. However, towards the end of the offensive, the People's Army of Vietnam deployed a weapon that would completely change the air war forever: the SA-7 shoulder-launched heat-seeking missile. Suddenly, strike, helicopter, and controller pilots were forced to fly above 9,000 to 10,000 feet or risk being shot down. At that altitude, precision strikes without guided weaponry were very difficult to execute. Up until now, Allied forces used air power with impunity, enjoying easy transportation and precision strikes at will with a low risk of losing aircraft. As the American soldiers pulled out, they took that privilege with them. After the Easter Offensive, American assistance executed Operations Enhance and Enhance Plus. Enhance restored the VNAF, as well as the rest of the Republic of Vietnam Armed Forces, back to optimal combat strength. Enhance Plus, on the other hand, was a specialized program intended to improve the VNAF, adding several of the most capable aircraft to its arsenal, including 3 F-5E squadrons and 2 C-130 squadrons. At the moment of the ceasefire, the Vietnam Air Force was the 6th largest air force in the world, only falling behind the United States, Soviet Union, China, France, and West Germany. While impressive on paper, the new communist anti-air technologies took their toll. By mid-1974, 136 SA-7 launches downed 23 aircraft. Radar-guided anti-aircraft artillery coverage effectively shut the VNAF out of large areas of South Vietnam, leaving only the bravest pilots willing to provide support for troops on the ground. With American support fully withdrawn, the greatest weakness of Western military doctrine started to affect the Vietnamese Air Force. South Vietnam was unable to afford the high operating costs of an air force with its underdeveloped economy. Spare parts and fuel stocks depleted, resulting in rationing and many aircraft being cannibalized to keep others in the sky. Even with these crippling issues, some Vietnam Air Force pilots continued to fight back. The VNAF continued to launch sorties and transport reinforcements during the fall of South Vietnam, even when it was clear that Saigon would fall. A-1s were still in the sky, protecting Tan Son Nhut Air Base. One was shot out of the sky with an SA-7. An AC-119 gunship also circled the city continuously, lighting flares and firing on advancing communist forces. It would eventually be hit by an SA-7 as well, and crashed into the ground in flames. An American on the ground reported seeing one of 3 parachutes get caught up in the debris and burned up in the air. On the morning of April 30th, A-37s launched the very last airstrike of the war, destroying 2 T-54s in support of the 81st Airborne Rangers on the ground, who themselves destroyed several tanks, stopping the PAVN 10th Division from reaching Tan Son Nhut Air Base. While the images of Vietnamese airmen fleeing to American ships dominate the collective memory of the Republic of Vietnam Air Force, others continued to fly alongside the Army, right until the end.